What if a work of art, a masterpiece so profound it brought experts to tears and was declared a national treasure, was a complete and utter fake? What if the man who painted it was not a revered old master, but a failed artist working in a dusty attic? This is the story of a forger who didn't just copy the masters. He created them, and in doing so, became a national hero for his crime. Our story begins not in a criminal underworld, but in the rarefied, often cruel, world of high art. Hermann van Meegeren was a Dutch painter in the early 20th century, a man of considerable technical skill, but with a style that was hopelessly out of fashion. While the world embraced modernism and abstraction, Van Meegeren clung to the classical techniques of the Dutch Golden Age. The art critics of his time were merciless. They dismissed his work as derivative, uninspired and technically proficient but soulless. To them, he was a relic, a second-rate painter imitating past glories. This scorn festered in Van Meegeren. A deep, burning desire for revenge began to form in his mind, a revenge not of violence, but of breathtaking intellectual deception. He decided he would not just imitate the masters. He would create a work so magnificent that the very critics who scorned him would be forced to declare it a genius masterpiece. His target was the most revered and enigmatic of all Dutch painters, Johannes Vermeer. With fewer than 40 known paintings, Vermeer was the perfect ghost to resurrect. This was not a simple act of copying. It was a resurrection. Van Meegeren dedicated himself to a fanatical level of historical accuracy. He sourced authentic 17th century canvases, scraping off the original, mediocre paintings. He learned to grind his own pigments, using period-accurate materials like lapis lazuli for the vibrant blues, just as Vermeer had done. His true genius, however, lay in chemistry. He needed to perfectly replicate the craquelure, the fine network of cracks that appears on oil paintings over centuries. After countless experiments, he discovered a secret ingredient, bakelite, a type of plastic. By mixing it with his paints and then baking the finished canvas, he could create a hardened surface that, when rolled, would crack with the perfect, aged patina of a 300-year-old masterpiece. After years of obsessive work, he was ready. He produced his magnum opus, a previously unknown religious work by Vermeer titled The Supper at Emmaus. The painting was sublime, a work of quiet, spiritual beauty that seemed to fit perfectly into Vermeer's known oeuvre. It was the bait for his elaborate trap. He didn't try to sell the painting himself. That would be too suspicious. Instead, he concocted a story. He claimed the painting belonged to an old, aristocratic family who had fallen on hard times and wished to sell it anonymously. The story was just plausible enough to be believed, a whisper of a lost treasure emerging from the fog of history. The painting was presented to the most respected art historian and Vermeer expert in the world, Dr. Abraham Bredius. For Van Meegeren, this was the moment of truth. Bredius was the gatekeeper, a man whose word could make or break a masterpiece. The old expert spent weeks studying the canvas. The verdict, when it came, was a thunderclap. Dr. Bredius, his voice trembling with emotion, declared The Supper at Emmaus not only a genuine Vermeer, but the masterpiece of his life's work. He called it a profoundly moving, spiritual painting from a previously unknown phase of the artist's career. The critics who had mocked Van Meegeren now celebrated his discovery. His revenge was complete. The success was intoxicating. The painting was purchased for a massive sum by a consortium and celebrated as a national treasure. Van Meegeren had done the impossible. He had not just fooled the world, he had enriched its culture with a masterpiece of his own creation. And with his method proven, he realized his revenge could also be incredibly profitable. He began to produce more lost works by Vermeer and other Dutch masters, creating a secret production line of forgeries. He became a wealthy man, living a life of luxury, all while secretly laughing at the art world that had once rejected him. He sold his fakes through a network of dealers, always with a carefully crafted backstory. His perfect crime may have remained secret forever, if not for the cataclysm of the Second World War. During the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands, one of Van Meegeren's prized forgeries, a Vermeer titled Christ with the Adulteress, was sold to one of the most notorious figures in the Third Reich, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. In 1945, with the war over, the Allies began the monumental task of recovering the vast trove of art looted by the Nazis. Deep in a salt mine, they found Göring's collection. Among the treasures was the previously unknown Vermeer. For the Dutch authorities, this was a shocking discovery. A priceless piece of their national heritage had been sold to the enemy. An investigation was immediately launched, led by a Dutch Allied officer named Captain Joseph Pillar. His mission was simple: find the person responsible for this act of treason. Selling a national treasure to the Nazis was collaboration of the highest order, a crime punishable by a long prison sentence or even death. The paper trail for the sale was complex, passing through several hands. But every path eventually led to one man, the charming, wealthy, and respected art dealer, Han van Meegeren. Pillar's team arrived at his luxurious Amsterdam home, convinced they had found their traitor. Van Meegeren was arrested on charges of collaborating with the enemy. In his interrogation, he was cool and evasive. He claimed he had simply been an intermediary in the sale. But Captain Pillar didn't believe him. He saw a liar and a traitor. Van Meegeren was thrown into a cold, grim prison cell, facing the most serious charge of his life. For 6 weeks, he languished in prison, the threat of a death sentence hanging over him. He was trapped. If he admitted to selling the Vermeer, he was a traitor. If he kept silent, he would be convicted as a traitor. He realized he had only one way out, a confession so outlandish, so unbelievable, that it might just be his only path to salvation. The breakthrough came during a tense interrogation. Pillar once again accused him of selling a masterpiece by a Dutch master to the Nazis. Van Meegeren, pushed to his absolute limit, finally broke. He looked at his interrogators and uttered the words that would change everything. "I sold it. I painted it." The officers were stunned into silence. They thought he was insane, a desperate man concocting a fantasy to save his own life. It was, on the face of it, a far more ridiculous story than being a simple collaborator. The idea that this man could have painted a work that had fooled the world's greatest experts was simply impossible to believe. But Van Meegeren insisted. He confessed to everything. He explained how he had created the supper at Emmaus, how he had fooled Dr. Bredius, and how he had painted a whole series of other forgeries. The authorities remained deeply skeptical. They needed absolute, irrefutable proof. The solution was as theatrical as the crime itself. The court ordered Van Meegeren to paint one final forgery, under the full scrutiny of the press and judicial observers. He was moved to a guarded house, given his canvases and pigments, and told to create one last old master. For weeks, the world watched as the forger went to work. With cameras flashing and reporters documenting his every move, he began to paint. He chose to create a new, original work in the style of Vermeer, a scene of Jesus among the doctors. It was the ultimate performance, his final act of artistic creation and confession. The painting he produced was his final masterpiece of deception. When it was finished, there was no longer any doubt. The scientific commission assigned to the case also analyzed the other paintings, discovering the presence of bakelite, the modern plastic resin that proved they could not be 300 years old. Han van Meegeren was telling the truth. The news exploded across the Netherlands and the world. the narrative instantly flipped. Van Meegeren was no longer a despised Nazi collaborator. He was a folk hero, a trickster genius, the man who had swindled the monstrous Hermann Göring himself, trading a worthless fake for millions of guilders. The Dutch public, looking for heroes in the grim aftermath of the war, embraced him. He was the clever rogue who had used his artistic talent to make a fool of the enemy. Göring, upon learning in his prison cell at Nuremberg that his prized Vermeer was a fake, was said to have looked as if for the first time he had discovered there was evil in the world. The trial, when it finally happened in 1947, was a global spectacle. The treason charges were dropped. He was now on trial for the much lesser crimes of forgery and fraud. He arrived at court each day to cheering crowds, a celebrity enjoying his final, greatest performance. The art experts he had fooled were publicly humiliated. Their reputations were shattered. Dr. Bredius, once the infallible pope of the art world, was now seen as an arrogant, gullible old man. Van Meegeren had achieved his ultimate revenge, a victory far sweeter than any amount of money. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. He was found guilty, but the sentence was a mere slap on the wrist, 1 year in prison. The public celebrated the lenient sentence. But in a final, ironic twist, Van Meegeren would never serve a single day. Just a few weeks after his conviction, before his sentence was due to begin, Van Meegeren died of a heart attack. He died a free man, a wealthy man, and in the eyes of his countrymen, a beloved national hero. The legacy of his deception sent a permanent shockwave through the art world. How had he succeeded so completely? The answer was psychology. He didn't just forge a painting, he forged a story. He identified a gap in Vermeer's history, his early, religious works, and filled it with exactly the masterpiece the experts were hoping to find. He exploited the arrogance and wishful thinking of the art establishment. The experts wanted to believe they were discovering a lost treasure, and their desire to believe blinded them to the evidence before their own eyes. They saw what they wanted to see. His forgeries forced a revolution in art authentication. No longer would an expert's eye be enough. Museums and auction houses began to rely heavily on scientific analysis, X-rays, pigment analysis, carbon dating, to root out fakes. The forger, in his own strange way, had made the art world more honest. And so, the story of Van Meegeren leaves us with a provocative, lingering question about the nature of art itself. If a forgery is so masterful that it evokes the same powerful emotions as a genuine masterpiece, does the identity of the artist truly matter? Where does the line between genius and imitation really lie?